Call Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak on the Public Finance Fiscal Responsibility Amendment Bill, third reading. The Green Party supports this legislation. It is essentially a good bill. What I think is quite interesting about this bill is that essentially the government is hoist on its own petard, because when you look at the principles that the government wants to introduce into the Public Finance Act, those principles are completely at odds with the government's own fiscal strategy. And let me take a few examples. The government wants to introduce a new section into the principles, which is that when formulating a revenue strategy, having regard to efficiency and fairness. Now, I think that this is a very sensible introduction of a principle into the Public Finance Act. However, what you have to ask yourself is, how on earth can it be fair that the government, as part of this cycle after 2008, gave away very large tax cuts to the wealthiest 10% of New Zealanders? How can that possibly be fair revenue strategy to introduce, as this bill rightly does, the principle of fairness into when putting together revenue strategy? How can it be fair to give the wealthiest people in New Zealand very large tax cuts while increasing GST, of course, for those who are on lower incomes? When you look at the impact of the government's tax cuts, it is the wealthy that did extremely well out of those tax cuts and the poor who got very little indeed from those tax cuts. How could that be considered an element of fairness into the tax system? And it seems to me that this is a good principle, but where is the fairness in the government's own revenue strategy? To consider another issue, what about capital gains tax? We know that New Zealand is one of the very few, if not the only OECD country not to have a capital gains tax, and the Greens have supported for many years a capital gains tax excluding the family home. The reason why this is an issue of fairness is that the very wealthy get most of their income from capital gains. So when you look at where people get their income from, you'll find that most people get their income from wages and salaries, and they pay taxes on those. That's what the PAYE system is. Pay as you earn, you pay taxes and income taxes on your salary. If you get income from capital gains, so if you own large numbers of shares and those shares are worth more this year than they were last year, and let's say you sell those shares and you make a big capital gain when you sell those shares, you don't pay tax on that capital gain. It's tax-free income. So why is it that we have a tax system which, for the primary kind of income for the very wealthy, which is capital gains, because they don't get most of their income from wages, why is it that that kind of income pays no tax, whereas it's ordinary working people who have to pay the bulk of the tax, which they pay through their wages and PAYE taxes? It seems to me that if you were to develop a tax system based on this principle of fairness, which the government wants to introduce in this bill, which I think is very sensible, surely a fair tax system would also tax capital gains, so that the very wealthy who make all their benefit, or not all their benefit, but most of their income from capital gains, would, in fairness, pay tax on those gains. There's another principle which the government is proposing to introduce here, which I think is a very good principle, which is when formulating fiscal strategy, having regard to its likely impact on present and future generations. I think it is really important that we have a long-term horizon when developing fiscal strategy. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. And in this respect, I think we need to ask ourselves the question of why does New Zealand not have a proper carbon tax or a proper price on carbon? We have the joke of the emissions trading scheme, which is just the pretence, a fig leaf of some kind of price on carbon, which has very little effect whatsoever on a real price on carbon. But if we had a proper price on carbon, whether through a carbon tax or an effective ETS, then that would be good for future generations. Very shortly I'll be attending an event put on by Generation Zero out the front, which is exactly about the issue of climate change. Now, climate change, you would have to say, of all issues, is going to have a massive effect on future generations. Human-caused climate change is accelerating, and of course New Zealand's greenhouse emissions are at an all-time high, and this government's removed most methods to control it. But one method to control it is to put a proper price on carbon, so that those who are emitting carbon would need to take into account the fact that they have to pay a price on it. For example, right now Fonterra are talking about digging a new coal mine in the Waikato in order to use the coal in their production. Now, they could equally replace that coal with, say, wood chips or alternative methods that have lower greenhouse emissions or carbon emissions, but they're choosing not to do that because there is no price on carbon, so they have no economic incentive to look at the alternatives to digging a dirty great coal mine as part of our clean green image. Not. Now, if we, under this principle that the government is introducing, considered the impact of fiscal strategy on present and future generations, then it seems to me a compelling reason to introduce a price on carbon, so that future generations wouldn't face the kind of problems that they are very likely to face as a result of climate change. Let's remember that New Zealand is a very small emitter by global standards, so we are entirely dependent on the rest of the world saving our bacon on climate change. New Zealand's entirely dependent on the big emitters making cuts, but we cannot ask the big emitters to save us if we ourselves are not willing to take any action on climate change. So we cannot protect future generations, as this clause within the bill proposes. If New Zealand itself does not take action on climate change, we can't ask the big emitters, the big polluters, to save us, which is essentially what has to happen with climate change, if we ourselves are not willing to take any action on it. So I think this is a very good, pardon me, a very good clause to introduce within the bill. One could likewise make the same argument about the tax cuts, which put a huge hole in the government's fiscal position and, of course, became the justification for asset sales for the government. That is, they cut taxes for the wealthy, then they said, oh dear, there's a big hole in the budget, we're going to have to sell assets in order to pay for schools. But more of that later. The other issue, of course, that the Labor Party has drawn attention to is the introduction of the clause which says, when formulating fiscal strategy, having regard to the interaction between fiscal policy and monetary policy. I would have to say I don't share the concerns that the Labor Party has raised in this respect. I think that the clause is fine, and I really do think Labor have got that wrong. I think that there's another part of this bill which I think is really good, which is the investment statement, the introduction of the investment statement. This, of course, has been, I think, a useful innovation, and I think it's important to understand how this would work. For example, if we were to look under the investment statement clauses, basically the government is required to present an investment statement to the House of Representatives, which would look at the value of the Crown's assets and liabilities. Pardon me. So if we were to look, for example, at the issue of asset sales within the context of the investment statement. Now, the government has just gone through with the Mighty River Power privatisation or partial privatisation. Now, we've just got the results of the annual results for 2012-13 for Mighty River Power just within the last couple of hours. And what they showed is that total shareholder return for Mighty River Power was 11% over the financial year 2012-2013. Now, total shareholder return includes both the increase in the value of the equity and the dividends paid out. So that was an 11% return from Mighty River Power. Now, the cost of borrowing to the Crown over the same period was 2.9%. Now, let's remember the government told us we had to go down the privatisation plan for some kind of to avoid debt. They had all sorts of nefarious reasons which didn't really make any coherent sense, but let's consider that particular argument. So in order to avoid debt of 3%, the government sold shares in an asset that was returning 11%. I mean, think about the business case. So here you are. So you've got this asset that's earning 11%, and you go, well, I want to sell this asset earning 11% in order to avoid debt that would cost me 3%. Now, what kind of business manager would come to you with a proposal like that? The kind of business manager that you would immediately sack. The kind of business manager who shouldn't be in the practice of providing advice around business. And of course the Treasury documents in the budget policy statement outlined exactly this case, where they said asset sales would increase the operating deficit because you would be selling assets with very good rates of return in order to avoid debt which has got pretty low cost. And in this case we know now, because we've got the actual numbers, we can quantify it, that basically the sale of 49% of Mighty River Power is now costing the taxpayer $2.3 million a week. That is the difference between what we could have returned on that asset, the 11%, as they've just told us today, versus the 3% cost of debt. So because we privatised 49% of Mighty River Power, or rather the government, the National Party did, it means that the position of the government, which I think would come up under the investment statement, is $2.3 million a week worse off. That's why I think it would be very useful to have this investment statement, and it's why we support this bill, to make it clear what terrible economic managers the National Party really are.
I call Maggie Berry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise with pleasure to speak to the Public Finance